Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event, Superconvergence, Transforming Lives in the Age of AI, Genetics, and Biotechnology. My name is Michael Kulma, and I'm the Head of Programs and Communications at International House at the University of Chicago and the Executive Director of OneShared.World. This important conversation is being brought to you by International House at the University of Chicago, our sister houses at International Students House London, International House at UC Berkeley, and by OneShared.World. Today's program is part of iHouse Chicago's Global Voices Lecture Series program. Before we jump into the content for today's program, let me share a little bit about International Houses and OneShared.World. From the day the first International House in New York opened its doors 100 years ago, with Berkeley, Chicago, and London to follow, we've been dedicated to the promotion of understanding and fellowship among the peoples of all nations. Through our programming and communities, we work to promote cross-cultural understanding, mutual respect, and friendship among international students, scholars, and the broader global community. That mission is manifest through programs like today's, and that mission guides the work of the 12 other international houses around the world. While OneShared.World is 96 years younger than the oldest of the international houses, its mission is in fundamental alignment with iHouse. OneShared.World was founded in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic as a community of thousands of people from around the world coming together to address the mismatch between global challenges we face and the predominantly national way we are organized to address them. These challenges are broader than deadly pathogens. They include climate change, ecosystem destruction, weapons of mass destruction, and global underdevelopment. The virus made it clear that we are interdependent. Each person's security and well-being resides in every other person and in our common ecosystem, and we must work together and help each other. That help is not charity. It's one of the best investments we can make in helping ourselves. To learn more about the work of iHouses and OneShared.World, please check out their websites and you'll see some things scrolling across the screen during the course of today's event. Now to our program. We're joined today by leading technology futurist, best-selling author, and founder and chair of OneShared.World, Dr. Jamie Metzl, as he unpacks his latest book, Superconvergence, Transforming Lives in the Age of AI, Genetics, and Biotechnology. In this book, Jamie explores how AI, genetics, and biotechnology are revolutionizing our lives, work, and the world. From ChatGPT to breakthroughs in biotech, today's conversation will help uncover how these advancements are reshaping healthcare, economies, and our global interdependence. Full disclosure, I've known Jamie for over 20 years, first in our work together in the Asia Society in New York, straight on through to the work with OneShared.World, so I'm especially excited to welcome him today. In the spirit of the missions of International Houses and OneShared.World, the conversation with Jamie will be moderated by young people. It's young people who will need to lead on these issues going forward, to ask the difficult questions, and to bring us together in recognition of our independence in dealing with the planet's greatest challenges and advances. In that effort, today we have with us three wonderful young leaders. Aashish Acharya. From Nepal, Aashish is currently pursuing a master's in artificial intelligence in London, where he lives in International House. He is passionate about exploring AI-driven solutions for real-world challenges. We have Alberto Saldarriaga from Peru. Alberto is a second-year Master of Public Policy student at the University of Chicago. His interests lie at the intersection of international development, education policy, and data analysis. Alberto is an International House Graduate Fellow for the 2024-2025 academic year. And last but not least, we have Divyansha Sehgal. She is a second-year Master of Public Policy student at the University of Chicago. She's a senior editor of the Chicago Policy Review, and she's a program manager for the Data, Ethics, and Policy HSO. Prior to being at Harris, she worked as a writer and researcher, primarily studying technology platforms and their politics. Following the conversation, the moderators will ask Jamie questions from the audience, so please feel free to drop your questions into the chat throughout the program. With that said, now over to Alberto to get the conversation started. Thank you very much.
A little personal question. So why made you write this book? And I don't know, maybe what would you like the audience to take from this book?
Great. Well, first, let me say, Alberto, Divyansha, Aashish, thank you so much for joining us. The biggest reason that I wrote the book is so that young people like you and the people who are hopefully watching and engaging can say, hey, something really big and exciting is happening. And I'm part of this story, not just in learning about it, but in guiding how these incredibly important and transformational revolutions play out over the course of time. I also need to say I'm thrilled to be here with International Houses and OneShared.World. Mike and I have collaborated on many, many things. And behind the scenes, pulling all of these pieces together is the brilliant, incredible Shagun Sethi. And Shagun has been part of OneShared.World from the very, very beginning. And from the title of OneShared.World and of International House, it's clear the main message of everything, which is that we're all in this together. That's why we founded OneShared.World. That's why we're here today. And all you have to do is just look at any news site, look out the window, experience anything to get the sense something really big and important is changing. For me personally, this journey has been now for at least 3 decades. And I was served in the Clinton administration on the National Security Council. And my then boss, Richard Clark, was the person who had in many ways predicted 9/11, but was powerless to try to stop it. And Dick always used to say that the key to efficacy in life is to try to solve problems that other people can't see, or at least solve problems, address problems in the early stages. And so for me, almost 30 years ago, I was thinking a lot about the intersection of our increasing tools in computer science, machine learning, what now we call AI, and our ability to manipulate and engineer biology. And I had a very strong sense that those stories were going to come together. So I started educating myself, reading everything that I possibly could. And when I was ready, I started writing articles for kind of boring policy journals on this topic. And those started to get a lot of attention. And a member of Congress, US Congress, read one of my articles and said, this is really important. I want to organize a hearing based on this. Will you help me organize and be the lead witness? And so I did that. And I was talking to a lot of people saying, hey, this is really big. It's coming. It may not seem like a big deal now, but it's coming. And I felt like I wasn't really getting traction. And at that point, I'd already written 2 books, A History of the Cambodian Genocide and a novel exploring the same kinds of issues. What does it mean on a human level to go through something as transformative as that? And so then I decided, well, I'm going to write novels telling the story of the genetics and biotech and AI machine learning revolutions as stories, because we're humans. That's how we have traditionally learned. So I wrote my 2 genetics, biotech, sci-fi novels, Genesis Code and Eternal Sonata. And when I was on my book tours for those novels, explaining the underlying science in my way, as someone who'd kind of taught it all to myself, I could see in people's eyes that they were not only saying, oh, this is a really important story, but they started to see themselves in that story. And that's when I realized, well, I needed to write a book about the genetics revolution, but write it in a way that people could absorb. And that was my last book, called Hacking Darwin, which became a pretty big international bestseller, which was the story of human genetic engineering. And 2 things happened after that. First, the Dr. Tedros and the World Health Organization, people read that book, and it came out just at the time as the world's first CRISPR babies were born in China. And it was a big ethical challenge. And so I was invited to be a member of the World Health Organization Expert Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing to think about governance issues. And second was I was doing on my book tours a lot of speaking around the world. And I never use notes when I give my talks. I just kind of wander around and think and engage with people. And I found that the story that I was telling just kept getting bigger and bigger, that there's this one story of human genome editing, which is a piece of a bigger story of human genetic engineering, which is a piece of the bigger story. And I was explaining to people what I felt that bigger story was, which is the thesis of my new book. And I'll just tell you what it is now, which is that after nearly 4 billion years of evolution, our one species suddenly has the increasing ability to engineer novel intelligence and re-engineer life, to engineer novel intelligence and re-engineer life. And the question that will determine our future is whether we can learn to use these godlike powers wisely. And that is, it's not just about what our governments do. It's not about what the UN does. It's about what we all do. And one of the reasons why it's so important for me to speak with, listen to, and engage with students like you, like the other people are listening, is that you guys are going to have to be, you're not bystanders in this story. You and we are all in the driver's seat, and that requires just a lot of learning together, a lot of sharing, and a lot of conversations about, well, how do we realize these aspirations in the world? So when you write a book, it's like you're kind of doing your thing, and you do it kind of quietly in your own little on your own little desk, and then it's an object that you're giving away for people to use and absorb in their own way. So I really am hoping, and it's been the case this far, that people use the book and that inspires them to maybe think a little bit differently, engage differently, ask tough questions of themselves and the people around them.
100%. Actually, coming from a background, I used to work for the Peruvian government 2 years ago before I came here to Chicago. And honestly, the book was amazing in the sense of like, it made me think outside the box a lot. And now me as a future public policy leader is like, okay, how can I translate these big ideas in actually concrete steps to actually improve everyone's lives? And actually, I think that one of the different questions that we have for this panel basically try to focus on the implementation part, on the barriers that we need to overcome.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's actually like an amazing journey. And I don't know, DV or Aashish, like what were like your main impressions or first impressions on this topic about the book itself?
Yeah, I would like to add, like, as I was reading the book, coming from an AI background, I didn't really think how important and how advanced we were being, and talking about all this gene editing and how AI will help in the healthcare or socioeconomic and everything together. I found it really fascinating, but what really grabbed me and made me think was the ethical dilemma that you were talking about in your book. And as like when we develop things or we make a new model or something like that, then we don't really think about the very long-term consequences and how it will reflect upon the real world. Like, I feel like right now the world is just focused on innovation and innovation and innovation, and there are a lot of gray areas in AI that haven't really been addressed, and there are no policies um, which address these issues as well. And I really liked one of your analogies that you have mentioned in what could go wrong section of your book, where you talked about how if we only focus on racing forward, then we will crash. So I felt that sometimes it's really fine if we can let go of the throttle a little bit to get a good to turn. So I really like that aspect of the book.
Yeah, me too. I echo everything that both Alberto and Aashish have said. I think to me, one of the things that definitely stood out was the fact that we really do need policy solutions or just forums for people to come together to have conversations around new and emerging technology, because it doesn't seem like unfettered capitalism or just like unsupervised productization of a lot of these technologies is going to end up protecting us from the harms that you have so clearly outlined. And I think one of the questions also just that I have later is around how do we think through institutions when so much of like our traditional institutions are not functioning as they as we're used to and as we would want them to.
Yeah, it's so important and so essential. And I just think that part of the process is we just have to look and understand. And then as young people and as idealists of all ages, is we have to say, where do we want things to be? And that's our goal. And definitely, certainly for me personally in the United States, you can just look for me. I look at what's happening in the United States and the reverberation around the world. And frankly, I find it extremely depressing. But also as people looking back at our history, all of our history, there have been ups and downs and twists and turns. And that doesn't mean that things getting better is inevitable by any means. But it certainly means that when those of us feel like things are moving in the wrong direction, we need to say, what little bit can I do to push things in a more positive direction? And if every single person just sees themselves as the entirety of the response, well, everything will seem insignificant. But coming together and say, well, what can we do? And it may take a month, a year, 10 years, a century. We just don't know. But humanity's going to go on, and we've got to just continually work towards achieving the best outcomes that we can imagine.
Maybe shifting a little bit of the conversation, and you're actually explaining this a lot, Jamie, at the beginning of the conversation. You mentioned that there's like a lot of conversation going on, that it's been going on for I don't know how many years in the past. And if we just focus, for example, in the healthcare system right now, the book tries to tackle a lot of different aspects, from, you know, trying to move from a reactive to a more predictive and preventive type of healthcare system. And this is, again, a conversation that it's been ongoing for years, and still we have like the health systems that we have so far. So I don't know if you can like explain to the audience, how can healthcare system realign financial incentives to prioritize this preventing care over treatment, especially, you know, in environments where fee-for-service models are the one that dominate?
Yeah, it's such a great question, because we can imagine better systems in healthcare, agriculture, or anywhere. And we can even build models that work. But the challenge is, how do we scale those models that work? So it's not there's just a few people experiencing something that's very niche, and whether it's a few people getting a gene therapy or a few people eating a cell cultured hamburger or whatever the thing is that we can imagine. So it's the right question to say, how can we align incentives? And the basic issue is right now, certainly in the United States, what we call healthcare is really sick care. It's symptoms-based sick care, where you have, when a symptom shows up is when we tend to go get treated. But it could be certainly for a genetic disorder that your age minus 9 months is when the seed was planted for that disorder. And it could have been much easier and much more cheaply. It could have been addressed earlier in your life. And it could be, as we have here in the United States, that the financial system has all these people with misaligned incentives. That, you know, I have brothers who are orthopedists, and the business model for orthopedics is doing surgery. And so if somebody is just doing clinics and saying you should strengthen your knee muscles and do a bunch of jump squats and planks, that's a bad business model. But if every single person who walks into your clinic gets surgery, that's how you get the weekend home in the mountains. And it's just insane. So there are organizational issues, and Alberto, you mentioned it, to try to shift systems towards fee for outcome, from fee for service to fee for outcome. It's also true that we're just going to have to reallocate how we put our energy. And you know, right now, every day, there are new studies coming out, for example, in the field of radiology, which are looking at basically the question is, if you have a bunch of radiology information and maybe some additional electronic health record information, there are three options. AI systems analyzing them alone, humans analyzing them unaided, or some combination of the two. We all like to think that the right answer is going to be humans plus AI, and that may be, but it may be that there are areas where machines are just way better than humans, in other areas where humans are way better than machines, and we're going to have to figure that out. And yes, exactly as you said, there are misaligned incentives here. But there are other countries that are organized differently, that actually have the opportunity to be much more intentional in how they are organizing. And they tend to be relatively small and well-funded. So I'm thinking of countries like Singapore, like United Arab Emirates, Estonia, Finland, Israel, relatively small countries, tend to be single payer. And it could well be that traditionally it's been that models develop in places like the United States and then get exported. But if a country like Singapore comes up with a better model for how to do healthcare, that actually can be scaled, certainly in places like this. So in addition to thinking about the technology, we're also going to need to think about incentives, and we're also going to need to be thinking about how we learn from each other. And it may be that some of these smaller places have a greater opportunity to build models. And if we have in some ways a competition of models, if those models are doing a better job of, for example, analyzing cancers earlier than we do here. I mean, there was a recent study of an AI algorithm that was picking up signs of cancer 5 years before primary care physicians. And that's really exciting. In Israel, Clalit is one of their national health management companies. And you will get a call from Clalit saying, hey, we've noticed from your movements and from this other information, we think that you are at an increased risk for a fall. Would it be okay if we sent somebody to your house just to make sure that you have handles in your bathroom and you're set up safely? And so we're going to move, I hope, if we're successful, earlier in the phase. You don't engage with the healthcare system just when you have a symptom, but earlier to become a more predictive and preventive system.
Just to follow up on that, Jamie, currently I feel like we live in a healthcare system where the system has not been able to guarantee basic benefits to everyone. So how would you think, like, we have all these advancements coming along, how would you think that these advancements will not just be for the privileged, like, select portion of people, and we can distribute this globally?
Yeah. It's a fundamentally important question, and it's a goal which will not be realized on its own. I mean, there are some people who are technology utopianists who just think, well, let's just let the technology run. It's not that that's entirely discredited, but if that's a goal, we need to from day one say that's a goal. And as we move forward in the timeline of diagnosis and response, as I just mentioned to Alberto's question, actually the interventions get a lot cheaper. That a lot of the diagnostics, and whether it's wearing an Apple Watch or a pulse oximeter, or just having your smartphone monitor how many steps you're getting, a lot of that can be done relatively inexpensively. And a lot of the response, the earlier you go if you're late in the game, maybe surgery is the only option. But if you diagnose a precursor to type 2 diabetes or something else 10 years in advance, actually just living like your grandparents lived with diets like them and exercising, which they didn't even call exercising, it just meant like living required going around. Those may be the best interventions. So I certainly think we're going to have a decentralization. And there are a lot of positive trend lines. A lot of the learning that used to be concentrated in individual places like the United States now can happen much more quickly. Just to give one example, my partner's father is a physician in Delhi in India. And he says that 20 years ago, when they had complicated cases, they had to refer them to the United States or Europe because certainly for oncology and other areas that there was such a big gap. But now the speed of knowledge transfer is so fast, they can actually treat a lot of those cases in India in a way that 20 years ago wouldn't have been possible. So we're seeing diffusion and distribution really at all levels. But like I said, it won't happen on its own. And if this is a goal, we need to push this goal. And we need to recognize really across the board that this is a story. It's not about machines. It's about human potential being realized. That's why we have the machines. We created the machines. And so the more people we have who are healthy and well-educated and connected to global networks, it's not just that we're doing them a favor. It's what Mike said in his introduction, referencing OneShared.World. It's the most selfish thing that we could possibly do is unlock the minds of brilliant people all around the world, wherever they are, and so that they can fully contribute to the world of innovation and progress. And it's not the case that all of the innovations happen at the highest tech level. I mean, there's so many great examples, but ultrasound in India is a good one. In India, they had all these clinics, and it was really hard to get the huge ultrasound machines. So Indian engineers came up with these mini ultrasounds, and that was an innovation that came. It was like the United States and Europe. It went to India, and then it was recast and came here. We're seeing that now, regardless of what the actual facts are with DeepSeek, there are innovations happening everywhere. And ultimately, if we don't totally screw it up, we'll all be beneficiaries of those innovations.
I want to both follow up and shift gears at the same time. If we move a little bit away from healthcare, but still focus on the points around decentralization and just like things becoming cheaper and more people having access to a more cutting edge biotechnology and work, I'm kind of thinking, like, given the pace of development and how a lot of these technologies come to market, we've seen a lot of different technology find their way to consumers. Like, there are ways to create pharmaceutical drugs based off of like chemicals you can find, chemical makeups you can find online, 3D print your own like kitchen labs and centrifuges. And I kind of see that also expanding out in the future. So some of the risks of decentralization also become more prominent in such a case, because we're no longer looking at like accidents from pathogens accidentally leaking from labs. We're also looking at it from people just sort of hacking something together. So I wanted to just get a little bit of your take on how do you think through like the regulation of how like governments could look at something like this when they might not even know that some of this research is being done by individuals.
Yeah, it's such a great question. And like everything that we're talking about, it's two sides of the same coin. The flip side of harnessing the brain power of as many people on Earth as possible is empowering everybody on Earth. And so on one hand, you can imagine people who are trying to do bad things, who are doing bad things. And you can imagine people trying to do good things where there are just mistakes. And so there's a natural response, which uses the word that you raised, Divyansha, regulation. But I think the broader word for what we really need is governance. So when I mentioned I was a member of the WHO Expert Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing, created after those first CRISPR babies were born in China in 2018. In my view, that was a massive ethical violation. But regulate, and when we worked for 2.5 years to come up with our plan of what we would recommend, And certainly regulation, government regulation was one piece of it. But because of distribution, government regulation isn't enough. The broader term is governance. And governance means what everybody does at every level. In my new book, Superconvergence, in the last chapter, I have a pyramid that outlines what I mean by governance. And at the bottom of the pyramid is individual education, engagement, and empowerment. It has to start with individuals. But individuals are part of bigger things. And so whether that is our companies, our universities, hospitals, labs, and so in those areas, there also needs to be senses of responsibility and mutual responsibility. On a national level, we need to have national systems, and we need to share best practices between countries. We need international cooperation and collaboration, which, I mean, right now that seems harder than ever, but it's the right answer. As I said before, we have to be working toward it. And as I say, it's connected to the vision of one shared world. We need a global operating system upgrade. We know the right answer. We just don't know how to get there. The right answer is that if the kind of key word of the 17th century after the 30 Years' War was national, the kind of Westphalian world around modern nation states, and the key word of post 1945 was international, with San Francisco and Bretton Woods, the recognition that if it's just a bunch of countries competing against each other, that's going to end badly. The key words for now, for what we need an upgrade of our global operating system based on the mutual responsibilities of our complex global interdependence. But it's hard to get there, is really difficult. Some of us were idealistic in the early days of the pandemic, thought maybe this shock is big enough, but now we seem to be heading in the opposite direction. But it was 150 years from when Immanuel Kant outlined his idea of a league for peace in 1795, 150 years and 2 world wars, until the United Nations was created in 1945. So I think it's the right answer. We can't get away from our interdependence because of all of these forces. And whether it's we are together on climate change, we're together on runaway technology, on nuclear proliferation, all of these other pandemics, it's the right answer. And there's just no bridge, there's no moat big enough to defend any of us entirely. And so that's why we need to figure this out. And because things seem so depressing now, it's why young people like you really need to be taking the lead. Because as I said before, our species, we had ups and downs and twists and turns. And the through line has been idealists keeping going and never losing faith.
I just wanted to add and follow up on what you said about cooperation and competition, because like you said, right now it feels like we're heading in the opposite direction. Like even recently we're having trade wars or even AI wars since last week, and feels like everyone is kind of fighting each other instead of trying to get together to build technologies that will enhance the human race. But instead, we are like kind of segregating on each on our own and trying to get like, oh, we are the ones innovating this. Oh, we are the ones innovating this. But there doesn't feel to, it feels like there's no unity in there. So how could we, like, there's no right answer for this, but could we as a whole society, could we even come to mutual values or mutual terms on what we might agree on and try to cooperate with each other? I don't
know whether we can achieve that goal, but we certainly can strive in that direction. And in my view, we must strive in that direction. And that's the whole idea behind One Shared World and the global interdependence movement. It's not to get rid of our countries, because I think right now they are the kind of organizational principles of organizational bedrocks of global organization. But if that's all we do, we're going to, because we've lived this world before of competing nations of states and spheres of influence and balance of power. We went through it in the 19th and the first half of the 20th century, and it ended badly. And if we pull out that same playbook now, for sure it will end equally badly again. And so that's the work. And do I think we will get there eventually? Yes. But there are two ways we're going to get there. One is by, like happened in the 17th century, in the middle of the 20th century, having a cataclysm that's so terrible that we crawl out of our holes and say, hey, maybe we need to do things differently. And hopefully we should be blessed with people who are as relatively enlightened as the people who laid the foundations of the post-war world in 1945 and those few years after, because those people could have done what everybody else, every other kind of nation in that position has done for all of human history. So that's what we don't want. We don't want us to say, well, it turns out that regulating and governing runaway super intelligent machines and biosafety and biosecurity and proliferating nukes and proliferating autonomous killer weapons, it was just too hard for us. And so we let it all go. And then we had this terrible thing, and now 1 billion people have died. I mean, that's the path that we're on. Seems that may be our most likely thing. And then at the end of that horrible thing, we'll say, all right, now we've learned that lesson. That's the 1945. But we could also say, we don't want to have to go through it. We have all these people, we're connected to each other. I speak to a ton of young people. Almost everybody shares this level of idealism and connectivity. And so many people are engaged on international global issues, whether climate or human rights or other things. So we just need to build this kind of movement. And it really seems depressing, but we remember in the 18th century, a few people got together in Cambridge in the United Kingdom and said, slavery is wrong. We need to have a movement. And that small anti-slavery movement became a big anti-slavery movement. When you look at the Indian independence movement, so many of these different movements start with people. And does that mean we're going to be successful today or tomorrow or in a week or a year? No. But it does mean that we need to just keep planting seeds and laying foundations.
Speaking about seeds, and again,
good transition.
Yeah, I know. And I was just checking on time, and we're running a little bit of time. So, but I really want to ask this, because it's the main chapter, at least for me, in the book. Yeah, I think one of the most pressing issues right now, as you mentioned, is climate change. It seems like the whole world is actually touching rock bottom actually in this topic right now. And something that we haven't talked about yet, and please feel free to be as technical and simple as possible, is genetics. I'm not an expert in that. I'm coming from a country that relies a lot in agriculture in general, that is facing a lot of challenges in terms of droughts and water shortages and floods and a lot of environmental disasters. I feel like genetics is the right path to follow right now, in terms of increased productivity, in terms of increased resilience. But something that it's still on my mind, and again, maybe I'm biased because I'm doing a public policy program, is what's the role of the government in all this? What should be the approach of governments in terms of genetics? If you ask right now a government official from Peru, probably the answer is no, I'm just gonna let the pharmaceutical company or the lab companies just to take charge in this. So basically they don't really want anything to do in all this. So I don't know what's your perspective about in terms of agriculture in general, food security. What should be the role of government in all this issue, and how can we find a strong partnership with the private sector?
Yeah, it's a great question, Alberto. For sure, we should be concerned about human pressured climate change and global warming, and we need to look across the board at what are creating the emissions and how do we respond. Right now, agriculture is a key driver of our emissions, And right now, half of all arable land on Earth is allocated toward agriculture. We have about 8 billion humans. We're going up towards 10 billion. And those 10 billion percentage-wise will be more wealthier people who are going to want to live diets, have diets like ours. And that's going to put enormous strain on our agricultural systems and on climate. So the question for us is, how do we increase agricultural productivity, which we need to feed everybody, and do it with fewer inputs of land, water, energy, and fertilizer? The right answer, obviously, is for everyone to become a vegetarian, because 70% of our agricultural use is allocated toward, in one way or another, supporting animal agriculture, mostly industrial animal agriculture. If everybody became a vegetarian, we would have so much free land, because it's about 30 calories feeding of plants to feed a cow to get 1 calorie of meat. So that's the right answer, but we're not going to do it. I wish we would do it. We're not going to do it. As a matter of fact, per capita consumption of animal products is going up pretty much everywhere, including in places like the United States and Europe, with all of the vegetarianism and health consciousness and everything. So we need to think about additional strategies for making our agriculture more productive. And as you know, Alberto, I write about this in the book, referencing actually Peru. And that is, agriculture itself is an incredibly radical form of biotechnology. The difference between the teosinte weed and what we call corn today is massive. The difference between corn, sustainable organic corn, and GMO corn is nothing. I mean, it's this tiny little amount. That doesn't mean we shouldn't look at it and be aware of it. And so the question is how do we increase that productivity and do it in a sustainable way? And there are very real concerns of the anti-GMO movement. Certainly, we should be worried about monoculture. We should be worried about concentrated corporate control of our food supply. But in the mix of what we do, I think biotechnology, aggressive biotechnology, has to play a role in increasing the yields of crops. And it used to be, in the traditional days, if you live in some river valley and it's productive, and then a bunch of people would have crops there, and then the population would grow, and then there'd be a drought, and then a bunch of people would die, but a few of the crops would live, and then you'd plant those crops, and you'd get more people, and then the drought would happen again, and that's how we got actually resilient people and resilient crops. We don't want to do it that way. We're not going to let 1 billion people die because of global warming. So unless we're going to move people away from particularly lands around the equator, which are getting warmer, we need to figure out how do we grow those crops and how do we make those changes in real time. And the new tools of the intersecting genetics, AI, and biotech revolutions are giving us some of those tools to actually go into plant genetics and boost yields, or make plants better able to survive in hotter climates, or better able to survive if with exposure to salt, if there's some kind of flooding of ocean water. And so I just think that we have to do, it's not the sole answer. We also need to think about how do we promote the so-called orphan crops, like places in Africa where they have a tremendous diversity of kinds of crops. The answer should not be what it was in the 50s, that everybody needs to grow wheat, corn, and rice, and they need to do it in a certain way. If you are growing wheat, corn, and rice, we need to help you do that far more productively. And there are massive productivity disparities between places like the United States and most of Africa. But also we need to say that that's not the only strategy. We need to really think about diversity across the board, and diversity in agriculture, diversity in how we think about healthcare, how we think about assisted reproduction. And that's why in the book I talk about these principles. It's the superconvergence of technology. It's the superconvergence of applications, because these same technologies are influencing all of these different fields. In some cases, people are jumping from one field to another. The field of cell-cultured animal products is populated by human physicians who are working in regenerative medicine. but also we need to think about values, the values of equity, diversity, a respect for the complexity of biology, and avoidance of hubris about just assuming that we can just change any system without being extremely careful. I mean, these same principles apply everywhere, but agriculture is one of the most important areas, which is why I have 3 chapters of the book focusing on that.
Thank you, Jamie. I think we also have a couple of questions from the audience. I want to make sure we don't take all of your time and get some questions from the audience itself. I think the first question here is, do you think the AI-driven decentralization can help reduce healthcare costs and make medical advancements more affordable to more people, considering the interplay of the AI war between nations?
I think it can. I mean, underlining the word can, it can, but it can also lead to other kinds of outcomes, so that none of these, like I said before, none of these imagined outcomes are inevitable. But certainly we are seeing a decentralization of AI models. So now everybody in the world, if you didn't have access, I mean, to the OpenAI ChatGPT, you got it through Meta's Llama open source model, and now you have it even more through DeepSeek, and we're going to see a proliferation of these AI models. We're going to see, and will increasingly see, a proliferation of different applications. But the key thing is developing systems that actually work. And so that the model, the formula that really exists across all of these fields is the better and higher quality data you have, the more computing power you have, and the stronger your algorithms, the more you and we are going to be able to decipher patterns from massive data sets, which will then give us opportunities to do things differently. And so it's very exciting as that gets decentralized. But again, none of this will happen on its own. So we really need to have a systems thinking, like for healthcare. How do we build responsible systems? Because right now we have a lot of safeguards. If you go into any quality hospital and you get a scan, and your scan and your radiology report comes back that, oh, you have cancer, you know that a lot has happened so that you can have a decent level of faith that that diagnosis is correct. If the more decentralized things get, the more people are going to get a lot of information and not know what to do with it. And that doesn't mean that's an unanswerable question, but it comes back to my point that these systems will not build themselves, and trust and credibility and infusing our best values into all of these systems and the structures and norms and processes, procedures around them, that's going to be really essential. Just proliferating AI algorithms will empower a lot of people, and I think a lot of good things and a lot of bad things will happen. But over time, we're going to have to systematize how we use these superpowers, which is, it's more and more complicated because it involves more and more people, and that is what brings me back to my earlier point about governance.
So I think the chat is also picking up on the systems question. So there's one more there on the basis of that. So genetic enhancements could create an arms race between nations as countries push to create superior citizens. What global governance structures do you think we need to prevent a geopolitical crisis?
Yeah, so I hope the person who asked that question will read my last book, Hacking Darwin, because that is exactly what the whole book is about. And it really could. I mean, we could have a genetic arms race. Right now, we don't know enough about complex human genetics, and our mechanisms for editing the genomes and maybe eventually systems biology of pre-implanted human embryos is not sophisticated enough to make big changes. But you could imagine that changing a lot. As I write about in Hacking Darwin, one of the ways is by genome editing pre-implanted embryos, and as far as we know, there's 3 humans alive now who are the result of that. But another way, I mean, our ancestors took wild chickens laying 1 egg a month and turned them into domesticated chickens laying 1 egg a day, knowing nothing about genetics. So just sorting sperm, sorting eggs, using induced stem cells to increase the female egg production, automating the technologies of human-assisted reproduction. You can imagine not even having to edit any genomes, but just right now, if you're going through IVF and you're doing embryo screening using pre-implantation genetic testing, maybe you can test 10 embryos. But if we use stem cells, and let's say you had 10,000 eggs that were fertilized, which is easily done by that equivalent number of sperm cells, and you had an automated system, and you said, I have 10,000 of my natural, unadulterated children. They're all in a lab, and I'm going to pick one to implant in the mother. You could actually push human evolution relatively quickly. These are the early days for that, but as I write about in Hacking Darwin, you can see that future from here. And that's why everything comes back to values, norms, structures. We have to lay the foundation for that future now, because people say, well, what about future inequality? And I say, there's a real danger of future inequality. But if you're worried about future inequality, the starting place for responding to future inequality is responding to inequality now. Because I live in New York City. It's literally a 10-minute subway ride from where I live to a part of town where people have an average life expectancy about 15 years less than where I am. It's a short flight to a place like the Central African Republic, where lots of kids are born with brains that don't function optimally because of maternal malnutrition in the context of an ongoing civil war. If we're okay with that now, why would we possibly think we wouldn't be okay with every form of inequality in the future? So we need to think about that. We need to be having these conversations. But the most urgent action is, what are we doing now so we can tell us that here's who we are now? And in every decision that we make going forward, we're going to say, all right, here is the choice, and here are our values, and here are how our values guide this specific choice. If all we do is say we're putting our pedal to the gas, our foot to the gas pedal, and we just want to have quote unquote progress at any price, and we're not integrating values everywhere, we're going to crash this car or wind up in a very unfamiliar place.
One additional question, Jamie. So how do you envision international cooperation and around issues like gene editing, AI, and genome sequencing, especially considering the political tensions between nations that are happening right now?
Yes, yeah. So I write about that in the book, and it's easy to get depressed about the world as it is today. As a matter of fact, it's a very logical response to what we're seeing in the world today. But we just need to keep pushing. I talked about the League of Peace in 150 years until the United Nations. So we can imagine it. If the founders of the United Nations had a time machine and they showed up now, they would all burst into tears. They would say, this is not what we had imagined. We had imagined so much more. So we just need to keep at it. We need to be doing events like this. We need to be engaging people, bringing people into the conversation. Consciousness, I say this all the time, consciousness raising is not enough. The whole climate change movement seemed to be in many ways about consciousness raising. And that was why I never thought not going to school on Friday helped anything. That it's not just about consciousness raising. Young people have never been more educated, engaged, or empowered as they are right now. So we need to really think about how do we build movements of influence in whatever way, and whether it's in whatever communities that we're in on a national level. We need to certainly talk about governance at every level, including government regulations. So the United States, under the Biden administration, we actually had some pretty decent executive orders on the governance of runaway AI. Right now, those executive orders have been rescinded and nothing is in their place. Europe has actually, in many ways, a more profound and meaningful conversation about governance than we have. China has probably a less informed one, but this is not something that's going to be answered overnight. We need to just keep working at it. But certainly on a national level, we need to be articulating. I'm having conversations with people, but it's very, very hard because there are these headwinds. But these headwinds will not last forever. In every country where any of us come from, there have been revolutions, counter-revolutions, collapses, rebirths, and we just have to keep building. But the right answer, for what it's worth, is what I outlined in that pyramid, is that every level, and many of us operate on multiple levels, we need to be saying, what do I need to learn? What are the issues? What do I care about? Who are the people in my world who I can engage with to make sure that we're acting as responsibly as possible, whether that's at the university level, the national level, or the international level.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Now it seems like we are kind of at the end of the discussion. Thank you very much to the audience for coming along. I just want to ask one final question. Please just give us the final remarks for today, and maybe to the audience who are watching, what kind of advice would you give to the people who are interested in pursuing their careers on like biotech, AI, or life sciences? What would you say to those people and to the audience listening right now?
Yes. So in general, what I would say is this feels like it's a conversation about technology, but ultimately it's not. Ultimately, this is a conversation about values. For everything that you're doing, if the starting point is how do I use this technology, it's the wrong starting point. The right starting point is who am I, what do I stand for, and what am I trying to achieve? And then how do I engage with technology in order to achieve those things? And we've talked about these underlying technologies, but the rubber will hit the road in applications. In the applications, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in every area of life. So values. In terms of careers, it's moving very quickly. And like I said before, one way to think about jobs that all of us will do is that if you think of whatever you may want to do, you can break that job down into, let's say, 10 subtasks. And for each of those subtasks, ask yourselves, 10 years from now, is this subtask something that'll be better done by machines, better done by humans, or best by something in between? If it's machines, your job is to learn, well, how do I engage with machines to do that thing? If it's humans, how do I index on doing that thing? And I hate it when I hear people saying, humans are the new Neanderthals, or even that there's this new thing coming, artificial general intelligence. What we're creating is not artificial intelligence, it's machine intelligence and maybe machine super intelligence. These aren't fake humans. They're just their own thing with ways of thinking that are inspired by what we are feeding them, but different from us. So there's a real future for humans, but you really need to be mindful. And in so many different areas, I'm looking at this in the context, there's virtual science laboratories that are coming, new kinds of algorithms. And right now, there's a human who's overseeing a constellation of different AI models under them. And so thinking about what we're doing, whether it's computer programming, for example, if someone was just saying, well, I'm a programmer, how do I think about programming? Well, there are going to be three kinds of programmers. There are going to be AI systems doing programming. And right now, Google, Sundar Pichai has said that a quarter of all of the code for all Google products, the first draft is developed by AI systems. There are going to be low-level coders who are doing stuff that those machines, for whatever mix of reason, can't do. And then there are going to be high-level coders who are thinkers, conceptualizers, visionaries, who are understanding the logic of these systems and the essential role that humans can play. And so people who are thinking about your careers, I would say don't get stuck in that middle space. Don't be competing against a machine doing a thing that machines can do better than humans. Really think about, what does it mean to be a great human in an age of revolutionary technologies? And there is so much. I mean, it just, like I said, it just drives me crazy when I hear people undervaluing what it means to be a human. Humans, we have so many tricks up our sleeves. We are not just narrow intelligence walking around on stilts. We are an embodied, evolved, creative intelligence and connecting with each other in so many ways. So trust in your humanity. Learn. If you're on this podcast or this conversation, you've been here for an hour, you are a learner. Follow your curiosity, your passion. Those are the things. Be great humans, and we need you to be great humans, because the future will be guided by humans, but we're going to be co-evolving with our technologies as we've done for many, many years.
Thank you so much, Jamie. And thank you to everyone for coming to the discussion session today. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.